David Heinemeier Hansson. I'm the original creator of Ruby on Rails, and I'm also a partner at 37 Signals, and I'll be speaking at RailsConf Europe in September in Berlin.
And we're in Chicago in Wicker Park, which is in a neighborhood also called Wicker Park, which is recursion.
It is kind of a recursion. I think the neighborhood took its name from the park itself, so I think that's just how it started out. And it's actually even weird in the sense that this area can't really figure out what it's called, whether it's called Bucktown or whether it's called Wicker Park. So most people even go for the even longer version, which is I live in Bucktown/Wicker Park. So it has somewhat of an identity crisis, it seems.
Speaking of Chicago, what made you choose to move to Chicago? You moved here from Denmark?
I did. I lived in Copenhagen, Denmark, otherwise pretty much all my life. I moved to Chicago about 3 years ago, and I moved because of 37 Signals. So the company was founded here in Chicago and has its base in Chicago. Half of the employees are here in Chicago, and Jason Fried, my partner at the company, is living here. And 3 years ago, everything just came together in the sense that I was done with school. I had the opportunity to come here. My girlfriend wanted to study at a university here, so we thought, hey, it would be a great opportunity to go here, and everything was just set up. It was kind of easy.
How have you found Chicago to be for technology and innovation? Does it have a rich culture of technology, or is it the same thing as San Francisco?
I think it's very different from San Francisco, and I think it's great because it's different from San Francisco, and I think it's actually great because I don't have a whole lot of sense of the scene being this place. Chicago for me is not about technology per se, which is why it works so well. I don't think being in a space or in a place that's primarily about technology is a good thing, in fact. I think there's a lot of groupthink going on the West Coast. I think there's a lot of bad memes that kind of just infects you when you live there. Chicago in some ways more of a neutral zone. There's not a huge startup culture. There's not a ton of tech parties all the time you can go to. There's not a ton of VCs just walking over to have lunch with you. And I think those are all pluses. I think those are all net positives. I think the things about Chicago is it's kind of this sense of just a city where you get down to work. And I really like that. I like the fact that it's not about all the extra stuff. It's about just businesses that are built and are profitable. So you kind of get away from the fluff that I tend to see a lot when I go to the West Coast. And of the companies, I think, that come out of that. I think companies that are otherwise founded and operated here have a more real sense. Like Chicago in many ways just feels more real. A lot less fake, a lot less polish, a lot less fluff, for lack of a better word.
So you recently spoke at Startup Camp. And
Startup School.
Startup School,
yeah.
Sorry. That was hosted by Y Combinator, is that right?
That's correct. Paul Graham has this early stage, I don't know if he calls himself a VC or not, probably not, early stage angel fund where he takes in a bunch of teams every, I think, spring and fall. And Startup School is kind of a conference for people like that, people who are starting new companies and doing it with Y Combinator money. So I got invited to speak there, and I think that it was a great opportunity for me because I love being in places like the West Coast to provide an alternate opinion, let's say it like that, on a number of topics. And I certainly did at Startup School, where the rest of the conference was in my mind, very heavily tilted towards the let's get VC, let's get eyeballs, let's get big, let's get bought kind of rumble or approach to company building, which I'm personally not a huge fan of, to say the least. So I offered an alternate idea of how to build a company, how to grow a company, how to not sell your company, and how to make it more about real stuff. The basic premise of the talk was how to get rich online, which had 3 factors. It had having a desirable product, and then the secret sauce being having a price for that desirable product, and thus making a profit without going all the kind of opposite routes you could go, like taking VC money or relying on advertising or whatever. Just charging end users, I think, is in many ways an underrated model in the whole Web 2.0 space, and especially in the West Coast.
So it's never a tough question, let's talk about Twitter.
Sure.
Do you feel it's fair for people to hold Twitter as the example for Rails scaling or not scaling? I mean, could you just talk a little bit about the indirection there when people say, well, Rails doesn't scale because Twitter doesn't scale? Prove or disprove that.
Sure. So any application, whether it scales or not, usually doesn't have a whole lot to do with the framework or the programming language or any of the other individual tech pieces in isolation. It's usually way more about their algorithms or their architecture or how it's all being put together. So when people talk about Twitter not scaling, which by the way is false, Twitter's obviously scaling. It's growing every single day. I use it every single day. Lots of people use it every single day. It has problems, sure, but it's not that it's not scaling. Not scaling kind of implies that the site went off the air. Twitter's never been more popular than it is today. It's never been growing faster. So in many ways I think it's working regardless of the problems that they're having. But as whether their problems pertain to Rails as a web framework, I think it's always just an irrelevant question. So to me, it kind of serves as a filter. If people make that connection in their mind that Twitter's having scaling issues, thus Rails can't scale, that just, to me, tells me more about that person than it tells me about anything else. It just tells me that they don't have a very, I wouldn't even say deep understanding of technology. I'd say they don't even have a very shallow understanding of technology, because that's just such a basic misconception that it's just really not interesting to me. And in any ways, I don't even care. I mean, even if that's the position that you hold or the opinion that you have, that you wouldn't want to use Rails because Twitter is having some issues, well, so what? I'm not going to lose any sleep or money or anything else over that. Everybody shouldn't use Rails. So if there's a small, or if there's some percentage of people who take that as their reason not to use Rails, all the better.
So when someone runs for office in this country, they do a lot of polls and they find out, negative sentiment and positive sentiment. Rails was sort of built as a reaction to heavy enterprisey systems. Right. And my take is that you unseated a couple of big titans.
Right.
Do you think that created a population of people that are just out to get Rails, and they say, well, look at Twitter. It doesn't work.
Oh, totally. Totally. And I think that's what Twitter's more about. Twitter is finding some rock or stick to beat Rails over the head with from people who've had a grudge all along. And there's plenty of people like that. And I think that just comes with the territory of rapid popularity. I don't think you can mention pretty much anything, whether it's an organizational technique or technology or cause or anything that has rapidly grown in popularity that hasn't had some sort of backlash, that hasn't had some sort of hater camp. And I think in many ways that just certifies that what we're doing is interesting. If there's nobody who's hating on it, you're typically not doing very interesting work. You're typically not doing anything that's different from what already is. You're not unsetting the status quo. So I take every outburst of hate or displeasure or whatever you want to call the pushback against Rails as part of a validation for what we're doing. I'd much rather have people talking about Rails in the sense of, oh, it can't scale because of Twitter, than nobody saying anything at all. Because the counterweight to that is usually that there's a huge camp of really, really passionate people. It kind of comes, as Kathy Sayer talks about, like balancing out the universe. If you have a bunch of super passionate users who love what they're doing with the tools, in case Rails, you cannot have order in the universe if you don't have some other camp that kind of pushes back against that. So I think it's absolutely a natural progression, and I think it happens with any piece of technology that grows and becomes popular, that it has to have those counterbalances.
So if you look at the curve of a technology, you've got the early adopters and then people who follow on the heels of people who blaze the trail, so to speak. Where is Rails now?
So we're definitely in many ways out of the early adopter phase. And that means a couple of things. It means that more people are obviously using it. It means that people who traditionally wouldn't play around with technology just for technology's own sake are getting interested. But it also means that the people who are playing around with technology for somewhat technology's own sake can somewhat lose interest. So these early adopters who were with Rails originally because they were interested and are interested in just new technology, some of them have definitely moved on. And there are other newer, shinier things out there. Rails is 5 years old. I started working on Rails more than 5 years ago. So it is obvious that, I mean, not everybody is going to have the attention span or the interest or whatever you want to call it to stick with it all along. They're going to find other things that they're going to be interested in that, which is totally great. I don't think that anybody being interested in Rails and then moving on is not necessarily a reflection on neither the person nor the framework. It's just we have different interests at different times, and a lot of these people from the early days helped Rails tremendously get going. So there's no hard feelings or anything else just because you find something that's more interesting to you. I think it's perfectly natural. And at the same time, it's perfectly natural that people coming on to the community now, being interested in the community, are of a different kind. So I just hope that some of the shared culture and so on still persists, though. Even though we change some of the characters in the community, that we can still maintain somewhat cohesion, somewhat of the same ideas and ideals.
What is the culture? From the outside, it appears to be somewhat bohemian, iconoclastic. Rails in its introduction was a challenge,
right? A
very successful challenge. And now it's moved to something that's established. Talk about the culture and how it is changing. I mean, do you see it changing? Is it becoming less of a culture of challenge and innovation and iconoclastic, bohemian weirdness, and more of a corporate?
So I think that you're definitely right. Rails started out being very much a rebel's cause. It was a rejection of a lot of dogma, a lot of established thinking on how things were supposed to be in other languages and camps, and there was a lot of pushback in that, and thus a lot of conflict, because people who were used to these ideas, these established approaches, not all of them took the challenge equally well. So that's no doubt going to create a certain amount of conflict. Now I think that there's a lot of the ideas that Rails originally pushed that started out being very controversial. Convention over configuration, to take one example, is almost now established wisdom in a lot of camps. So that makes it lose a little bit of its edge, but I think these things will keep popping up. There'll keep being new arguments where Rails will take a position and thus be somewhat rebel-ish. So one of the more recent ones is the whole thing over web services. We're going to use the heavy, cumbersome stacks of SOAP and WS Death Stars and what else have you, or we're going to go with the lighter weight REST approaches and so on.
And I'll interrupt you. It is possible to use SOAP from Rails using a library called SOAP for R, but it is an awful exercise.
It is, and I don't wish it on my worst enemies. A lot of things that we do and the opinions we hold are for people who get to pick. So I don't have any hard feelings or look down upon people who have to use SOAP or whatever, because that's just what they have to do as part of their job. It's for people picking new systems where they have more of a greenfield approach or greenfield choice as to what technologies to use, that I can't understand that people would pick these most of the time. So Rails will continue to take opinions on stuff like this, and they'll continue to be a source of contention regarding that issue. But at the same time, I also think it's very inward-looking to consider Rails as this outward, just established technology, because it's very established in a very short, small period of people. There's still so many more people doing C#, Java, what have you, PHP, or whatever. That group of people is still endlessly larger than the group of people who are doing Rails. So even though we've been around for almost 5 years, we have a huge user base. It's a drop in the bucket compared to this established scene of established technologies that represent in many ways the counter to what Rails is about. So there's so much more still to be done. But I think it's easy to lose sight of that. When you're reading the same blogs, going to the same ISC channels, going to the same conferences, we have a tendency to think, oh, everybody's like me. Everybody's using Rails, this is boring, this is all established. But it's really not. It's just a small pocket of all the things that are out there.
Could you talk about how IronRuby and JRuby are either co-opting the energy of Ruby?
So it's actually fun because in many ways Sun started out as in, I don't want to say, like the evil empire in terms of practices and in terms of tools and approaches that they pushed on people.
Many would still call them the evil empire.
And I think they are, but the thing perhaps I've realized, and a lot of people realize, that there's not just one empire. The empire is not united. There's many fractions inside of Sun that are doing very nice work for noble causes. And I think that Charles Nutter and the whole JRuby team, I've actually hung out with them a bunch of times at a bunch of different conferences, and they're awesome guys, and they're doing really interesting, good work, and they're on the side of, let's say, Ruby versus Java. But I think that they're also doing a pragmatic thing. There's a lot of people out there who work in environments where Java is the established technology, and they have a huge base of existing infrastructure and so on that they're forced to work with. So it's not like there's really much of a choice.
In your startup camp talk,
right,
you specifically talked about companies that pay people to design frameworks and APIs.
Right.
That's a big mistake.
In my mind, it is. I think it's a little different on things that are very established. So, for example, re-implementing Ruby in Java is not a design exercise in the same way as designing a brand new API for something, or designing a language or something else like that. I think that when you're doing that kind of work, not re-implementation, not working against the spec, so to speak, just working on that thing alone, just working on the framework or whatever, is not a very good approach. I don't like that at all. But for re-implementing Ruby in JRuby, I think that's fine. I think you can totally work on that full time because you have a very, the scope is defined. So you don't need to make those choices that are so hard to make when you're not working on something real. This is definitely a little of an abstract distinction, but I definitely have to believe that frameworks such as Ruby on Rails cannot be made by people who are working on it full time. You cannot design that kind of thing if you're not working on real stuff with real constraints at the same time. And I don't think you should have to. I think it's much more enjoyable anyway to kind of be the both the consumer and the producer at the same time, and you get to make better decisions, you get to have more fun, and so forth.
Robert Lefkowitz, have you ever heard him talk?
No.
He spoke at the open source convention in Portland about 3 weeks ago. Great speech about the difference between technia and praxis. It's the difference between doing and sort of the leadership of men. It's the division between engineering and arts and sciences.
Right.
Is it that Rails and other successful technologies are designed in an engineering context with a real set of requirements and a real product to support that makes the difference? Well, versus just working on an API or a framework in an abstract, almost scientific?
I definitely think that in my mind, I group the scientific and the engineering part somewhat together. I think both of those are wrong paradigms for something like Rails API development. In my mind, it's actually way more the arts and the crafts and that sort of the craftsmanship approach to things. That you're building tools as you're using them, and that's the only way to arrive at useful tools. So I don't like the term engineer. I don't consider myself an engineer. I think that the
What would you call yourself if someone asked you to say, choose a word?
Craftsman, I think, is a very much more appropriate term and paradigm for what it is that we're doing. And I think that just embodies so much more of the combination of it's halfway art, it's halfway, there's some science obviously involved, there's some engineering involved, but it's bound together by a different kind of pragmatism about getting the work done.
So let's talk about process a little bit.
Sure.
You're in Chicago, which is the home of ThoughtWorks.
Yes.
I know Martin Fowler one could consider him to be one of the grandfathers of Agile.
Mm-hmm.
Although he might be offended that I call him a grandfather.
Yeah, I could do that.
Agile seems to have latched onto Rails as one of its demonstration technologies. How do you feel about that?
I think it's more the other way around, really. So Rails latched onto Agile as, in some ways, an implementation. So there's a lot of the ideas in Agile I thought were hopefully incompatible with the techniques, or not techniques, the tools that they were being used with. So a lot of the Agile work has been done using Java or C# and so on. And sure, it can be done, but I don't think that those platforms or those...
Oh wait, hold on. Birds.
Those tools and those platforms didn't really encapsulate or try to embody the ideas and the culture and the thinking of Agile. So Rails tries to do that explicitly. Tries to bake stuff in like you should do testing. There's no way to opt out of the testing stops that are being generated when you're using the Rails generators. There's a lot of just these ideas from Agile that we try to just embody in the implementation of Rails. And I think that definitely makes a difference, that there's a lot of choices you can make in creating your tools and your platforms that correspond to certain underlying thoughts of paradigm. And I think that the Javas and the C# and so on of the world embodies a different era, a different paradigm style, a more waterfallish approach, a project management style that's just not very compatible with the Agile ideas.
So there's a lot of crosstalk. Do you talk to people from ThoughtWorks a lot about process and method, or are you sort of... Chicago has a culture of Agile people.
Right. Well, it hasn't been so much focused around Chicago, but I definitely have talked to the ThoughtWorks guys lots of time. I hang out with Martin Fowler and the rest of the ThoughtWorks guys pretty often at various conferences, and we definitely share a lot of the same ideals. But at the same time, we also work in somewhat different spheres. So I'm in product development, and they're doing consulting, and in some ways those are kind of different territories, and different approaches work well for those different scenarios. But there's a lot of overlap, and I think those guys definitely have it right on a lot of issues. And I'm happy that they're pushing Agile and pushing these kind of thoughts on and into kind of enterprisey scenarios, because a lot of their customers are very enterprisey in the negative sense of that word in my mind. And it's good that they're trying to spread these memes, spread these thoughts, and hopefully in a few decades we will have gotten away from a lot of the bad stuff that's currently going on.
But once that happens, what's next? And that's a question for you. Are there technologies that are catching your eyes that aren't related to what you do, where you're saying, that's interesting,
sure,
I need to look at that for inspiration for Rails? Or
there's definitely a lot of technologies I think that are cropping up that are very interesting to me. So one of the things that was very controversial in the beginning of Rails was I should say, in many senses, my opinion of the role of the database. I've long treated the database as mainly being a big hash. And I think it's interesting to see that recently things like CouchDB or Bigtable or other implementations that actually treat the database even more so as a big hash, or perhaps implement a big hash as sort of like a database, are cropping up. I think that's very interesting. I haven't been able to do a whole lot of work with it yet, but I think it's that's super interesting, and it's very much in line with what we've always been kind of saying in the Rails camp. So I think that's really cool. I think another thing we were actively using and have changed a lot of things are memcached, and especially the whole idea of using expiration in keys or key generations or whatever you want to call it, where you're not doing one of the last hard things in computer science. I remember, or I forget who told me about this, was there's concurrency and then there's cache expiration. And actually, in many ways, Rails tries to sidestep both of them, try to treat concurrency as not an end programmer concern, and let's get rid of cache expiration and just deal with caches as identified by keys. And I think memcached kind of enabled that whole move. So that's very interesting to me. Let's see, what else is out there?
Well, I have a question about
sure.
things like Bigtable, things like the way that Google does all of their systems.
Right.
Changing the paradigm of an application. Most applications are built, say 99% of applications are built to service and support a relational database. Are there tools right now that are available for people to work towards something else, to work towards the CouchDB model without having to sort of fit a square piece into a round hole?
No, I think that that's one of the things that still haven't been worked out quite well. Like, I still don't have a very clear picture of how would I turn Basecamp into working on or running on CouchDB? How do you deal with permissions in scenarios like that? There's a lot of unresolved questions, which is why I'm interested in it, because it's a field or something, a piece of technology that shows great promise, but all the questions haven't been answered yet. So that's why it's kind of on the horizon. We're not already using it. If all the questions were already answered, it would be an established piece of technology in my mind.
Basecamp and Rightboard, you've scaled these horizontally, is that correct?
Yes, very much so. Well, we kind of do both. So on the application side and on the web side, we scale them horizontally. If we want more capacity, we add more application servers, more mongrels, more web servers. But actually currently on the database side, we're not doing it like that. We're scaling up. So we just bought an even bigger box to handle the database for Basecamp. And
is there only one, or is it a cluster of MySQL databases?
There's only one. There's one that runs primary, and then we have a slave, but the slave is as a backup machine.
So you're just doing binary replication between the two?
Yes. Yes, exactly. Okay. But only for backup purposes. All reads, all writes go to a single big-ass machine. And we do that because it's easy. And we'll do that as long as it remains easy and economical. Currently it still is. It's a 128 gigabyte machine in terms of RAM, and by the time that we need more than that, hopefully you can get a 256 gigabyte machine and we can continue to do this. But at some point it might not be feasible anymore. There's tons of applications where it's not feasible anymore, and then they have to do other things. They have to do sharding, they have to do things that make scaling beyond a single box possible, but painful.
What Rails sites that you know of shard, and how do they do it?
Good question. I remember being in conversations where I've talked to people who've done some of this, but there's not a whole lot of apps that really need it. I mean, Basecamp is a pretty big application. We have a lot of customer on it, a lot of usage, but we don't even need to shard yet. And in some ways, it just comes because as technology moves on, hardware gets cheaper and cheaper. And in my mind, you don't want to shard unless you positively have to. It's kind of a last resort approach. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
It's starting to rain.
It's going to come down.
If you get the idea that interview wasn't complete, you're right. We had about 10 more minutes to go. I was going to ask him questions about the future direction of Rails, what's beyond Rails, but also ask him to comment on some of the interesting applications. We couldn't get to those questions because a Chicago Public Park employee walked up to us and asked me to shut off the camera. I had assumed that talking about Rails on public property was legal, but evidently one needs a public permit to discuss Ruby on Rails in a public park in Chicago.